not to lose it, in the literal sense. After all, as everyone knows, the females of these insects often bite off the heads, and other body parts, of the males immediately after or even during mating. Scientists from New Zealand have discovered that males of one species of mantis may employ a specific tactic to defend themselves against attacks by aggressive females. The influence of sex hormones leads to an increase in aggressive behavior in female praying mantises. Furthermore, as they are larger and heavier than the males, they often resort to cannibalism. Females are capable of eating not only their mates, but even their own young, if the latter have not managed to take refuge after hatching from their eggs. This allows the female to obtain the nutrients necessary for rearing her offspring. In approximately 40 to 50% of cases, mating proceeds without incident. However, for a male praying mantis, sexual intercourse is a veritable game of Russian roulette. It's a matter of luck. A male Chinese mantis stands motionless on a milkweed stem an hour before dawn, one foreleg raised, not moving a single segment of his body for 11 minutes straight. 12 centimeters away, a female, 3 times his mass, grooms her own antennae with slow, deliberate strokes. He is close enough to touch her. He does not move. If he gets this next part wrong, she will turn around, seize his head between her raptorial forelegs, and eat it, while the rest of his body is still trying to mate with her. Every instinct in the animal kingdom says a male should not walk toward the one act most likely to end his life. And yet, across at least 15 species of mantis, that is exactly the calculation males make every single mating season. Today we are going to find out why a male will risk decapitation to reach a female, why losing his head sometimes helps him finish the act instead of stopping it, and how a piece of laboratory folklore about this insect turned out to be almost entirely wrong. Praying mantises are ambush predators, built for stillness. A female Tenodera sinensis, the Chinese mantis introduced to North America in 1896, can grow to 10 centimeters and strike a moving target in under 50 milliseconds using raptorial forelegs lined with spines. For most of the year, she hunts alone, defends a patch of vegetation from other mantises, and treats anything that moves within range, including other mantises, as potential food. There is no pair bonding, no shared territory, no courtship display in the way a bird or a mammal would recognize one. Outside of the mating season, a male mantis that wanders too close to a female is simply prey. That baseline threat never turns off. It is the backdrop against which every single approach happens. So when the mating season arrives, sometime between late summer and the first frosts of autumn, males have to solve a problem no other predator of their size regularly faces: how to get close enough to a creature that will kill and eat them on sight without triggering the response that ends the encounter. The odds are not symmetrical to begin with. A female Chinese mantis can weigh 2 to 3 times as much as a male of the same species, and that size gap is not an accident of individual growth. It is a pattern repeated across the mantis order closely enough that biologists have a name for it: sexual size dimorphism, and a long-running argument about why it exists at all. One explanation ties the female's bulk directly to egg production, since a larger body can carry and provision a larger clutch. Another ties it to exactly the danger a male is about to walk into. The bigger the female, the more formidable a threat, and the more that has to be overcome by stealth rather than strength. Whatever the deeper cause, the practical result is the same for every male standing at the edge of a female's territory. He is not approaching an equal. He is approaching an animal that could physically overpower him in an instant if the encounter turns hostile, and no amount of speed or reflex on his part changes that basic mismatch. His only real advantage is patience. The first solution is speed reduction, taken to an almost absurd extreme. Entomologist Catherine Lorenz, working with European mantises, Mantis religiosa, in the 1990s, documented males taking up to 60 minutes to close a gap of less than 2 meters. A human walking at that pace would take roughly 4 hours to cross a football field. The male freezes at the slightest twitch from the female, sometimes for 10 or 15 minutes at a stretch, then resumes his crawl only once her antennae stop tracking him. One clumsy final lunge, one vibration through the wrong leg, and the calculation flips instantly from courtship to predation. He makes it to striking distance. Then everything changes at once. The female's head snaps toward him. For a fraction of a second, it looks like the approach has failed completely, that 11 minutes of frozen patience were wasted. But she does not strike. Instead, in a movement so fast it barely registers on standard video, the male leaps directly onto her back from behind, out of reach of her forelegs, and grips her thorax in a position she cannot easily reverse into. It is not romance. It is a calculated ambush of the ambush predator, executed by the smaller, weaker animal, and it buys him perhaps a minute before the next crisis. High-speed camera studies of this leap, filmed at several hundred frames per second by researchers studying mantis biomechanics, show the entire jump and grip sequence completing in well under half a second, faster than the female's own strike reflex, the one adaptation evolution has handed the smaller sex in an arms race it would otherwise always lose. That minute is not enough. The female begins to twist her abdomen and flex her neck, trying to bring her head around far enough to reach him. Researchers studying the New Zealand springbok mantis, Myomantis caphra, an invasive species first recorded near Auckland in the late 1970s, found that in this species, males have gone further still. In roughly 60% of observed encounters, the male attacks the female first, delivering a rapid series of strikes to stun her into stillness before mounting, effectively neutralizing the threat before it can neutralize him. A courtship ritual in this species now looks almost indistinguishable from a fight. He is not the only male with this idea. On a single stand of tall grass, field surveys have recorded 2, sometimes 3 males converging on the same well-fed female within the same night, drawn by the same chemical cue, a pheromone she releases that can carry on the wind for tens of meters. A second male arriving mid-approach does not trigger a duel in the way it might in a bird or a mammal establishing dominance. Instead, it adds a second live variable to an already narrow margin. More movement near the female, more chances for a twitch to be misread as a threat, more competition for the same brief window before her hunger or her patience runs out. Some males respond by breaking off entirely rather than risk a clumsy, rushed approach forced by the presence of a rival. Others accelerate, trading caution for speed, a trade that field data suggests raises their odds of being caught mid-approach rather than after a successful mount. Assume he survives the mount. He is not safe. He is now anchored to an animal capable of biting through the exoskeleton of a beetle. And copulation in mantises is not a brief encounter. It can last anywhere from 20 minutes to more than 6 hours, depending on species and temperature, during which the male has no way of releasing his grip without exposing himself to her forelegs again. Every minute he stays attached is another minute her hunger, her mood, and the local food supply can tip the outcome in either direction. Some pairs finish and separate without incident. In other encounters, the female begins to reach backward mid-copulation, and this time she connects. There is a third danger neither animal controls. A pair locked together for hours, motionless on an exposed stem, is no longer 2 fast, alert predators watching their surroundings. It is a single, slow-moving target, and shrikes, warblers, and other insectivorous birds regularly take mantises off open perches during exactly this kind of extended encounter. Field researchers tracking marked mantis pairs through a mating season have recorded entire couples lost to a single strike from above, the risk shared equally by both animals for as long as the male stays attached, regardless of which of them the female eventually chooses to eat. Wind matters too. A stem that sways too hard in a gust can dislodge a male mid-approach, throwing 11 minutes of careful positioning away in a single second, and forcing him to start the entire crawl over from a worse position than before, closer to the ground, further from her flank, with less cover than he had the first time. What happens next is the detail that made this species famous nearly a century and a half ago. In 1886, American entomologist Leland O. Howard published one of the first detailed scientific accounts of sexual cannibalism in mantises, after observing captive females consume their mates. And the finding startled a discipline that had barely begun to think about behavior as something shaped by evolution rather than instinct alone. But it was a different scientist, working decades later, who explained the strangest part of the story. In 1935, physiologist Kenneth Roeder discovered that a male mantis with no head is not necessarily a male mantis that has stopped mating. The insect's subesophageal ganglion, a nerve cluster in the head, normally suppresses the reflex loops that drive copulatory movement in the abdomen. Remove the head, and that suppression disappears. The remaining nerve cord, still intact along the length of the body, keeps firing the same rhythmic signals on its own. In some observed cases, a decapitated male's abdominal movements did not stop. They intensified. For decades, this became the textbook explanation for why cannibalism and mating were linked in this insect. Decapitation, the story went, was not the end of reproduction, but an accelerant for it, freeing the body to complete its task without the inhibitory signals from a brain that might otherwise hesitate. It made for one of the most quoted facts in popular science writing about insects, repeated in classrooms and nature documentaries for 2 generations. Roeder's original experiments were carried out on insects pinned and restrained on laboratory boards, wired to instruments that measured nerve activity, rather than left to behave naturally in vegetation. And that detail would matter enormously to the researchers who eventually went back and questioned his conclusions. For nearly 50 years, though, his interpretation stood largely unchallenged, folded into textbooks as one of the cleanest available demonstrations of a nervous system's inhibitory circuits, an insect that seemed to prove a brain could restrain a body, right up until the moment the brain itself was removed. There is a common belief, built directly on Roeder's early findings, that male mantises are essentially always eaten during mating, that decapitation is close to a guaranteed step in reproduction for this insect, and that losing his head is, in some strange evolutionary sense, the male's actual goal. That is not what field data shows. In the 1980s, researchers Michael Liskey and William Davis re-examined mantis mating under conditions closer to how the insects actually behave in the wild, at night, in darkness, without the bright lights and cramped enclosures that had defined most laboratory studies since Roeder's era. Under those quieter conditions, males performed the same elaborate slow approach, the same leap and grip, and completed copulation successfully without losing their heads at all. Cannibalism rates measured in wild and semi-wild field studies since then have varied enormously by species and season, with some populations showing sexual cannibalism in as few as 13% of encounters, and others closer to 60%. Figures that undercut the old idea of near-universal decapitation. The behavior is real. It is not the default, and it is not required. It is a risk that shifts depending on hunger, habitat, lighting, and species. One edge in a much larger and messier gamble. Which raises the actual evolutionary question researchers have spent decades arguing over. If cannibalism is not required for mating to succeed, why does it persist at all? And why would a male's genes tolerate a trait that sometimes gets him killed mid-task? Part of the answer lies in what the female gains. Studies on several mantis species, including work led by biologist William Brown and colleagues in the early 2000s, found that females who cannibalize a mate can produce larger egg cases, sometimes containing meaningfully more eggs than females who do not, because the male's body itself becomes a substantial nutrient package at a moment when the female's own reserves are being converted directly into offspring. From the female's perspective, in a year when prey is scarce, a mate within striking range is not just a mate. He is the single largest meal available, and consuming him can measurably raise the number of surviving young she produces that season. From the male's side, the calculation looks almost as harsh. A male mantis that successfully transfers sperm and is then eaten has still reproduced. His genetic line continues regardless of what happens to the rest of his body once the task is done. Some researchers, including entomologist William Brown, have proposed that being consumed may even extend the duration or intensity of copulation in certain circumstances, marginally increasing the odds that his sperm, rather than a rival's, fertilizes the eggs. If that holds even partially true, a male is not a victim of a design flaw. He is operating inside a system where the worst-case outcome for his body still counts, in the only currency evolution tracks, as a win. Not every male draws that card. Field observers have documented males abandoning an approach entirely if a female's posture signals unusually high aggression, retreating and searching instead for a calmer target elsewhere in the same patch of vegetation, sometimes traveling several meters to try again with a different female rather than press forward against unfavorable odds. Others mate multiple times across a season with different females and are never touched, surviving purely because they read the signals correctly every time, or because the female they approached had already fed recently and had no interest in a second meal that night. Survival for a male mantis is not a matter of luck alone. It is a running calculation, repeated encounter after encounter, weighing hunger cues, distance, temperature, and the speed of a twitching antenna, with a wrong read costing him everything in less than a second. By the final weeks of the season, the outcome is written across the vegetation in a pattern any field biologist can read at a glance. Females that mated and fed on their partners are visibly heavier, their abdomens swollen with the egg cases, or oothecae, they will soon anchor to a branch in a foam that hardens within hours into a protective casing holding anywhere from 10 to 400 eggs, depending on species. Those egg cases will overwinter through frost, sometimes through snow, sealed and inert until temperatures climb again in spring. The males who contributed to them, headless or intact, dead or still hunting elsewhere in the same field, have already finished their part in the story. What is left is not a tragedy in the way a human observer instinctively reads it. It is a transaction completed on both sides, paid for in different currencies, by two animals that were never going to meet again, regardless of how the encounter ended. There is no partner for the following season. There is no memory of this one. Mantises live for roughly 1 year from egg to death, a single generation with a single mating season and no possibility of a second attempt if this one goes wrong. which is part of why the calculation each male makes carries so much weight in such a short window of time. There is no next spring for the individual, only for the eggs he leaves behind, sealed inside a casing he will never see hatch. What remains, when the frost finally breaks the following spring, is that casing on a branch, a hardened foam capsule a human collector or a curious naturalist might tap, without knowing 30 or 40 tiny mantises, some species closer to 100, could scatter out of a single ootheca smaller than a thumb, offspring of an encounter neither parent survived to see through to the end. The female who fed and produced it is gone by then too, killed by frost, by a bird, by the same hunger that once drove her to eat a mate. Her single season of life closed out, regardless of how many egg cases she managed to anchor before the cold arrived. Nothing about this system is cruel in the way a human observer's first instinct suggests, and nothing about it is romantic either. It is simply a ledger, balanced in a currency that has nothing to do with affection, and everything to do with which genes make it into the next generation. And in that ledger, a body, even after it stops moving, can still count as a contribution rather than a loss. Right now, somewhere in the tall grass at the edge of a field, in whichever hemisphere is heading into late summer this year, a male the size of a paperclip is beginning that same 11-minute crawl toward a female who could end him in under a second. Because for his species, that has always been the only door to the next generation.